The year was 1876, and dust swirled through Willow Creek Station like whispered promises broken on the wind. Evangeline Hartwell clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, her blue cotton dress already dusty from the long train journey. She had been sitting on that wooden crate for 3 hours now, watching every face that passed, hoping to see the man who had promised to marry her. But Joshua Whitmore was nowhere to be found, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the distant mountains. What Evangeline didn't know was that 20 miles away, another man was riding hard toward the station, his horse's hooves pounding against the desert earth. Nathaniel Nate Garrison had received word that morning about the abandoned bride, and something deep in his chest told him he couldn't let her sit there alone. As darkness fell, Evangeline shifted uncomfortably on the crate, her back aching from the rigid posture she had maintained all afternoon. The station master, a kindly older gentleman with silver whiskers, had approached her twice already, asking if she needed assistance. Each time, she had politely declined, insisting that her intended would arrive soon. But as the shadows grew longer and the other passengers from her train had long since departed, doubt began to creep into her heart like winter frost. She pulled the crumpled letter from her pocket for the 100th time that day, reading Joshua's careful script. "Meet me at Willow Creek Station on the 15th of September. I will be there at 2 o'clock sharp, wearing a brown hat and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers." The letter was dated 3 months ago, when she had still been living in her aunt's cramped boarding house in Philadelphia, working her fingers raw as a seamstress to earn enough money for the train. Fair West, the marriage arrangement had seemed like divine providence when Joshua's advertisement appeared in the newspaper. Honest rancher seeks virtuous woman for marriage and companionship. Must be willing to work hard and start a new life in Colorado territory. Evangeline had responded immediately, her heart full of hope for a better future than the one that awaited her in the crowded Smoky City. Life in Philadelphia had become increasingly difficult after her parents died in the influenza outbreak of 1874. Her father's small cobbler shop had been sold to pay his debts, and her mother's few pieces of jewelry had barely covered the funeral expenses. Evangeline had been forced to move in with her mother's sister, Aunt Prudence, a stern woman who ran a boarding house for working girls and made it clear that Evangeline's presence was more burden than blessing. The work at Morrison's dress shop had been tedious and poorly paid. Evangeline spent 12 hours a day hunched over a sewing machine in a stuffy room, with 15 other girls, stitching seams and hemming skirts for the wealthy ladies of Philadelphia society. Her fingers were perpetually pricked with needle marks, her back ached constantly, and her eyes strained from working by lamplight when orders ran late into the evening. The other seamstresses had been kind enough, but most were saving every penny to send back to families in Ireland or Germany. There was little money for friendship or entertainment, and Evangeline often felt as though she were slowly disappearing, one stitch at a time, into a life of gray monotony. Their correspondence had lasted for months, with Joshua painting pictures of wide open spaces, clean mountain air, and a modest but comfortable ranch house where they would build their life together. He had written about morning rides to check on cattle, about the way the mountains looked when the sun first touched their peaks, and about the satisfaction of building something lasting with your own hands. "I believe a man and woman should be partners in all things," he had written in one letter. "I need someone who can work beside me, who can find joy in simple pleasures, and who isn't afraid of a little dirt under her fingernails. In return, I can offer a comfortable home, protection, and the kind of life where every sunrise brings new possibilities." His letters had been filled with small details that made Evangeline feel as though she were already part of his world. He wrote about his horse, a bay mare named Duchess, who had a habit of stealing apples from his pocket. He described his neighbor's dog, who howled at every full moon, and the way wildflowers carpeted the meadows each spring. Most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings, asking about her dreams and listening to her answers with what felt like sincere attention. When he had finally proposed marriage through the mail and sent money for her train ticket, Evangeline had felt as though her prayers had been answered. She had carefully saved the money he sent, adding to it her own meager savings until she had enough for the journey west and a small emergency fund. The night before she left Philadelphia, she had packed her few belongings with trembling hands, her heart torn between excitement and terror at the magnitude of the step she was taking. But now, sitting alone on a crate as the desert wind picked up and sent tumbleweeds rolling past the station, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps Joshua had changed his mind. Perhaps he had taken one look at another woman and decided that a mail-order bride was no longer necessary. Perhaps his letters had been nothing more than pretty lies designed to lure a lonely woman west. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Evangeline look up hopefully, but it was only a freight wagon heading toward town. She sighed and smoothed her skirts, trying to maintain what little dignity she had left. Her stomach growled softly, reminding her that she had eaten nothing since the dry biscuit and weak coffee served on the train. That morning, she had been too nervous to eat much then, and now she was too proud to ask the station master for help. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Evangeline began to face the possibility that Joshua wasn't coming at all. She had exactly 47 cents in her purse, barely enough for a meal, let alone passage back to Philadelphia. Even if she could afford the return journey, what would she go back to? Her aunt had already rented out her small room to another girl, and her position at the dress shop had been filled within a week of her departure. The train journey west had taken for days, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar and closer to what she hoped would be a new beginning. She had watched the landscape change from the industrial smokestacks of Pennsylvania to the rolling farmlands of the Midwest, then to the endless prairies that seemed to stretch to the very edge of the world. Other passengers had come and gone at various stops, but Evangeline had remained, her destination still hundreds of miles ahead. During the long hours on the train, she had practiced what she would say when she first met Joshua. She had rehearsed polite conversation topics, worried about whether her appearance would meet his expectations, and wondered what their first days together would be like. The other women in her train car had been kind, sharing advice about marriage and frontier life. But as they reached their own destinations and she continued alone, Evangeline had felt increasingly isolated and uncertain. At night, sleeping fitfully in her hard seat as the train rocked and swayed through mountain passes, she had sometimes awakened with a moment of panic, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But then she would remember the cramped boarding house, the endless hours at the sewing machine, and the feeling that her life was slowly slipping away one dreary day at a time. Whatever awaited her in Colorado had to be better than what she had left behind. The station master appeared at her side again, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss, begging your pardon, but it's getting mighty late. Are you certain someone's coming for you?" Evangeline looked up at the kind man, her throat tight with unshed tears. I thought so, sir. But perhaps I was mistaken. What's your name?" "Child, Evangeline Hartwell. I came from Philadelphia to marry Mr. Joshua Whitmore. He was supposed to meet me here at 2 o'clock. The station master's expression darkened slightly, and he glanced around as if making sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Joshua Whitmore, you say?" "Yes, sir. Do you know him?" The older man removed his cap and scratched his graying head, his discomfort obvious. "I'm afraid I do, miss. Joshua Whitmore lit out of here about 2 weeks ago with a gambling debt the size of a small mountain and a reputation for broken promises. Word is he headed south toward Mexico, leaving behind more than one young lady who thought she was going to be his wife." The station master's words came out in a rush, as if he wanted to get the painful truth spoken as quickly as possible. "He came through here regular like for about 6 months. Always talking big about his ranch and his plans. But folks started noticing that his stories didn't always match up. And then Mickey at the saloon started asking questions about money Joshua owed him. Turned out our Mr. Whitmore had been living high on credit and promises, betting on cards and horses with money he didn't have. Evangeline felt the world tilt around her as the full scope of her situation became clear. Not only had Joshua abandoned her, but he had apparently never been the man he claimed to be in his letters. The ranch, the cattle, the comfortable life he had promised. It was all lies constructed to lure her across the country for reasons she didn't want to contemplate. The words hit Evangeline like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the full extent of her situation became clear. She was alone in a strange territory with no money, no friends, and no prospects. The carefully constructed future she had imagined crumbled around her like a house of cards in a strong wind. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of such news," the station master continued gently, "but if it's any comfort, you're better off without the likes of Joshua Whitmore. He's a snake in fancy clothes." "That one," Evangeline nodded numbly, not trusting herself to speak. She stared out at the darkening landscape, wondering what would become of her now. The desert seemed vast and unforgiving, stretching endlessly in all directions. She had never felt so small or so alone. Meanwhile, Nate Garrison was pushing his horse harder than he normally would, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite explain. He had been in town earlier that day when old Pete from the station had mentioned the young woman waiting for Joshua Whitmore. The news had stirred something protective in Nate's chest, something that had been dormant since his own wife had died in childbirth 3 years ago. The memory of Martha still had the power to stop him in his tracks sometimes. She had been everything good and pure in his world, with her gentle laugh and her way of making their simple ranch house feel like a palace. They had been married only 2 years when she became pregnant, and both of them had been over the moon with excitement about starting a family. But the birth had gone wrong from the start. The doctor from town had been delayed by a bridge washout, and by the time he arrived, there was nothing he could do. Martha had died in Nate's arms just after dawn, their son following her within the hour. In one terrible night, Nate had lost not just his wife but his entire future as he had imagined it. The months that followed had been the darkest of his life. He had thrown himself into work on the ranch, driving himself and his cattle with a reckless intensity that worried his neighbors and ranch hands. Mrs. Rodriguez had arrived during that time, a widow herself who understood grief and quietly began taking care of the household tasks that Martha had once handled with such care. Gradually, Nate had found his way back to something resembling normal life, but he had built walls around his heart that he never intended to let down again. Love, he had decided, was too dangerous a luxury for a man who had already lost everything once. Better to focus on the ranch, on building something solid and lasting that couldn't be taken away by fate or circumstance. But hearing about the young woman abandoned at the station had awakened something in him that he thought had died with Martha. Perhaps it was the injustice of it, or perhaps it was simply that he couldn't bear to let someone else suffer because of Joshua Whitmore's selfishness. Whatever the reason, he found himself saddling his horse and riding toward Willow Creek Station without fully understanding why. Nate had known Joshua Whitmore, and he knew the man's character was as reliable as a broken fence in a windstorm. Joshua had worked briefly at a neighboring ranch the previous summer, long enough to earn a reputation for laziness, dishonesty, and a quick temper. He had been fired after only 6 weeks when money went missing from the ranch house, though nothing could be proven. When Pete had described the young woman's determined vigil at the station, Nate had felt his jaw clench with anger at Joshua's callousness. No decent woman deserved to be abandoned like that, especially not one who had traveled so far based on promises that were never meant to be kept. The more he thought about it as he rode through the gathering dusk, the angrier he became. As his horse's hooves ate up the miles between his ranch and Willow Creek Station, Nate found himself thinking about what he would say to the woman when he arrived. He wasn't looking for a wife, not really. The grief from losing Martha still sat heavy in his chest, and he had convinced himself that love was a luxury he couldn't afford to risk again. But he couldn't let an innocent woman suffer because of Joshua's selfishness. The lights of Willow Creek Station came into view just as the last traces of daylight faded from the western sky. Nate could see a lone figure still sitting outside the building, and his heart clenched at the sight. She looked so small and vulnerable in the gathering darkness, like a lost bird far from home. He dismounted quietly, not wanting to startle her, and approached slowly. In the lamplight spilling from the station windows, he could see that she was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with auburn hair that had partially escaped its pins. During her long day of waiting, her dress was simple but well-made, and despite the dust and wrinkles from travel, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of good breeding and strong character. "Excuse me, miss," Nate said softly, removing his hat. "Are you Miss Hartwell?" Evangeline looked up, startled by the deep voice. The man standing before her was tall and lean, with dark hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold genuine concern. He wore the practical clothes of a working rancher, and there was something about his presence that made her feel less afraid, though she couldn't say why. "Yes, I am," she replied cautiously, "though I'm not sure how you know my name." Pete inside told me about your situation. "I'm Nathaniel Garrison, but most folks call me Nate. I own a ranch about 20 miles from here." Evangeline studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ill intent, but found only honesty and compassion. "Mr. Garrison, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure what you think you can do about my situation." Nate knelt down so they were at eye level, his hat dangling from his fingers. "Miss Hartwell, I know this might sound forward, and I know you don't know me from Adam, but I have a proposition for you." Evangeline's back stiffened slightly. She had heard enough about the kinds of propositions desperate men made to desperate women, and she wasn't about to compromise her virtue, no matter how dire her circumstances. Nate seemed to sense her wariness and held up a hand. "Nothing improper, I assure you. I'm talking about honest work and a respectable situation. I need help at my ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, is getting on in years and could use an assistant. The work is hard but fair, and I pay decent wages. You'd have your own room in the house, meals provided, and complete respectability. Why would you help a stranger?" Evangeline asked, though her heart was already leaping at the possibility of salvation. "Because Joshua Whitmore is a coward and a liar, and no decent woman should have to pay for his sins," Nate replied simply, "and because I know what it's like to be alone in the world." Something in his voice told Evangeline that Nate Garrison understood loss in a way that few people did. She found herself trusting him despite having known him for only a few minutes. Perhaps it was the genuine kindness in his eyes, or perhaps it was simply that she had no other choice. But she felt herself nodding before she had fully made the decision. "I would be grateful for the work, Mr. Garrison, though I should warn you that my experience with ranch life is quite limited." A smile tugged at the corners of Nate's mouth, the first she had seen from him. "I figure anyone brave enough to travel across the country to start a new life has the grit to learn whatever needs learning." And so it was that Evangeline found herself climbing into Nate's wagon. As the stars began to appear in the clear desert sky, her trunk was loaded in the back, along with her few other possessions, and for the first time since stepping off the train, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The ride to Nate's ranch took nearly 2 hours, and they talked quietly as the wagon rolled through the moonlit landscape. Nate told her about his cattle operation, his late wife Martha, and the challenges of ranch life. Evangeline shared stories of her life in Philadelphia, her work as a seamstress, and her dreams of finding a place where she truly belonged. "Mrs. Rodriguez will be glad for the company," Nate said as they approached a cluster of buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "She's been the only woman on the ranch since Martha died, and I think she gets lonely." The ranch house was larger than Evangeline had expected, a solid 2-story structure built of local stone and timber. Warm light glowed from several windows, and she could see the outlines of barns and corrals nearby. It looked like a place where people actually lived and worked, not just survived. Mrs. Rodriguez, a motherly woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, welcomed Evangeline as if she were a long-lost daughter. Within minutes, she had Evangeline seated at the kitchen table with a hot meal and a cup of strong coffee, chattering away in a mixture of English and Spanish that somehow felt like the warmest welcome Evangeline had ever received. "You poor child," Mrs. Rodriguez said, patting Evangeline's hand. "That Joshua Whitmore, he is no good. I told Seagur Nate when he first started talking about bringing in a bride, I said, that man, he will break her heart, but you are here now, and we will take good care of you." Over the following weeks, Evangeline settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She helped Mrs. Rodriguez with cooking and cleaning, learned to tend the vegetable garden, and even tried her hand at mending the cowboy's clothes with her seamstress skills. The work was indeed hard, but it was honest work, and she found satisfaction in contributing to the life of the ranch. The ranch hands were a colorful group of men who had initially been skeptical of having another woman around, but Evangeline's willingness to work hard and her lack of airs had quickly won them over. There was old Cookie, who had been cooking for ranch crews for 30 years and taught Evangeline how to make biscuits that could feed 20 hungry men. Tom and Billy were brothers from Texas who could rope a steer faster than most men could blink, and they delighted in teaching Evangeline how to identify different cattle breeds and understand the subtle signs that indicated when a storm was coming. Most of the hands lived in the bunkhouse, but they took their meals in the main house kitchen, creating a boisterous family atmosphere that Evangeline had never experienced before. In Philadelphia, meals had been quiet, hurried affairs, eaten standing up or in cramped boarding house dining rooms where conversation was discouraged. Here, dinner was a time for storytelling, good-natured teasing, and planning the next day's work. Evangeline discovered that she had a talent for organization that served the ranch well. She created systems for tracking supplies, helped Mrs. Rodriguez plan meals more efficiently, and even took over the bookkeeping when she noticed that Nate was struggling to keep up with the paperwork. Her education, limited though it was, proved valuable in ways she had never expected. But it was the small moments that meant the most to her. The way Nate would tip his hat to her when they passed in the yard, the quiet conversations they shared on the porch after dinner, when he would tell her about his plans for expanding the herd or improving the grazing land, the way he listened when she talked about her dreams of maybe someday having a vegetable garden large enough to sell produce in town. That Nate was a considerate employer, always polite and respectful. But Evangeline began to notice the way his eyes followed her as she went about her tasks. There was nothing improper in his attention, but there was something deeper than simple appreciation for a job well done. She found herself looking forward to their conversations over dinner, when he would tell her about his day and ask about hers with genuine interest that made her feel valued in a way she had never experienced before. Sometimes she would catch him watching her as she worked in the garden, his expression thoughtful and unguarded. When their eyes would meet, he would look away quickly, but not before she saw something in his gaze that made her heart beat faster. It wasn't the calculating look she had sometimes seen from men in Philadelphia, men who saw her as nothing more than a potential convenience. This was different, warmer, as if he saw her as a person worthy of attention and respect. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, Evangeline realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The ranch felt like home in a way that Philadelphia never had. She loved the wide open spaces, the clean air, and the sense of purpose that came with each new day. Most of all, she found herself drawn to the quiet strength and genuine kindness of the man who had rescued her from what could have been a desperate situation. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nate finally spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. "Evangeline, I know this might not be what you planned when you came west, but I've grown mighty fond of having you here." She turned to look at him, her heart beating faster at the serious tone in his voice. "I've grown fond of being here, Nate. I'm not Joshua Whitmore," he continued, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I can't promise you fancy things or an easy life, but I can promise you honesty, respect, and a love that's built on something real." "Are you asking me to stay?" Evangeline asked softly. "I'm asking you to marry me," Nate replied, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Not because you need rescuing, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." Nathaniel Garrison, when Nate kissed her there under the vast Colorado sky, with the mountains standing guard around them and the stars beginning to appear overhead, Evangeline knew that sometimes the best journeys were the ones that didn't end up where you expected them to. She had come west to marry one man and found love with another, but more than that, she had found herself. Their wedding took place on a crisp November morning, with Mrs. Rodriguez serving as matron of honor and the ranch hands as witnesses. The preacher from town performed the ceremony in the ranch house parlor, with wildflowers from the mountain meadows serving as decoration. It wasn't the grand wedding Evangeline had sometimes dreamed of as a girl, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. As winter settled over the ranch, Evangeline and Nate built their new life together with the same careful attention they gave to tending their cattle and land. They talked long into the cold nights about their dreams for the future, planning improvements to the ranch and maybe someday adding children to their family. When spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, Evangeline often thought about that September day when she had sat on a crate at Willow Creek Station, believing herself abandoned and alone. Joshua Whitmore's betrayal had seemed like the end of the world then, but now she could see it for what it truly was, the beginning of the life she was meant to live. The ranch had become more prosperous under their joint management. Nate's practical knowledge combined with Evangeline's organizational skills and attention to detail had resulted in improved efficiency in every aspect of the operation. They had expanded the herd, improved the grazing rotation system, and even started selling eggs and vegetables to other ranches in the area. But more than the material success, it was the sense of partnership that made their marriage special. They made decisions together, worked side by side, and supported each other through the inevitable challenges that came with ranch life. When a late spring blizzard threatened the newborn calves, they worked through the night together, moving cattle to shelter and ensuring that every animal was accounted for. When drought threatened their water supply, they planned and implemented a solution together, digging new wells and creating irrigation systems that would serve them for years to come. Their relationship had deepened beyond what either of them had thought possible when they first married. What had begun as gratitude and mutual respect had grown into something much more profound. They had learned each other's moods and rhythms, developed their own private jokes and shared memories, and built the kind of trust that could only come from facing life's challenges together. Mrs. Rodriguez often smiled as she watched them work together, remembering her own long and happy marriage to her late husband. "Mio," she would tell Nate when Evangeline was out of earshot, "you have found something special with that girl. She is not just beautiful, she is strong. Strong in here," she would tap her chest, "where it matters most." Sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispered through the pines and Nate's steady breathing told her he was asleep beside her, Evangeline would offer up a silent prayer of gratitude. She had learned that love wasn't always found where you expected it, and that sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as the most difficult challenges. She thought sometimes about the other mail-order brides who had answered Joshua's advertisements, wondering what had become of them. Had they found their way to safety and happiness, or were some of them still struggling to recover from his deception? She made a mental note to ask around discreetly, thinking that perhaps she and Nate could help if any other women were in situations similar to what hers had been. The ranch thrived under their joint care, and their love grew deeper with each passing season. When their first child was born the following winter, a daughter with Nate's dark hair and Evangeline's determined spirit, they named her Hope, for she represented everything good that had come from what had once seemed like the darkest moment of Evangeline's life. Hope was followed 2 years later by a son they named Samuel, after Nate's father, and then by twin girls, Grace and Faith. The ranch house that had once felt too large and empty was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, and the life that Nate and Evangeline built together was richer and more fulfilling than either of them had dared to dream. Years later, when their children would ask how their parents had met, Nate and Evangeline would tell them the story of the abandoned mail-order bride and the cowboy who came for her, but they would always emphasize that the real story wasn't about rescue or salvation, but about two people who found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. The old wooden crate at Willow Creek Station eventually rotted away, replaced by a proper bench for waiting passengers. But Evangeline never forgot the weight of that crate beneath her, the feeling of being lost and alone in a vast wilderness, and the sound of approaching hoofbeats that changed everything. She had learned that sometimes you had to lose your way completely before you could find your true home. And in the end, that was exactly what happened to Evangeline Hartwell Garrison, the woman who came west to marry a stranger and instead found love, purpose, and a place where she truly belonged under the endless Colorado sky. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.